So I'm going to start by talking about market failures, which is the main thing economists think about when we think about policy. Okay, so I think the main thing I want to kind of lead with is we need to clarify what the role of government is here. Decisions by employers about whom to hire is in so many ways like a fundamental private free market decision, right? And so why would we think that the government should be intervening, that the employers are somehow making the wrong decisions? In this case, in this context, the decision not to hire people with criminal records. What makes us think that those are mistakes where we could be improving market efficiency and make everyone better off if we were intervening to change them? And so the question here is, what's the justification for government intervention? Simply not liking who employers decide to hire isn't a good reason for the government to go in and change things, right? That's the way economists at least view the world. There needs to be some market failure that we're aiming to correct in order to justify that intervention. And I think focusing on that market failure not only is important for the justification, but it also can help point us to potential solutions. If we understand the problem we're trying to correct, it can identify kind of what the gap is that we're trying to fill. Okay, so in this context, there are at least two market failures. So one is that hiring someone with a criminal record can have what we would call positive externalities to the community, right? So there are some direct benefits that the employer would receive, but there are other benefits to the broader community. For instance, if it reduces future criminal behavior, it would make the community safer, that any rational profit maximizing employer is simply not going to consider. It's not part of the factors that are important to them. And so this means the number of people with criminal records who are hired are going to be below what we would think of at a socially optimal level. And that would mean that the government would have justification to subsidize hiring people from that group or to incentivize that. The other big market failure here is imperfect information. So imperfect information makes it difficult for employers to identify the people who have criminal records but would still make good employees, right? So this means that there are socially optimal employee and employer matches that could be made that right now are not being made because employers don't have enough information about the job applicant in front of them to be able to see what a good employee that person would make. And so in this case, providing more information to facilitate those kinds of matches would make markets more efficient and improve social welfare. So these are, in my mind, kind of the two big market failures that give us reason to be brainstorming about policy solutions in this room. Okay, so let's talk about the first one. So if government now has an incentive or a reason to subsidize hiring people with criminal records, we can think about a couple ways to do this. There are two types of costs that employers face when they hire someone. One is just the direct cost, like their wages, right? Whatever you'd be paying that person. The other is the risk of bad behavior, right? So if they do something bad on the job, this might lead to a lawsuit or just bad press and might have financial consequences for them. So let's address each of those in turn. Subsidizing wages, so kind of a little Econ 101, the way economists would think about this, is that employers are going to hire someone if the marginal benefit exceeds the marginal cost. So that is, if the value of that applicant would bring to their business is greater than the amount it would cost to pay them to do the job, then the business is going to hire them. So if we want employers to hire additional people, we need to reduce the costs that they face, okay? And there are a couple ways to do this. One is what we call wage subsidies. And one form of wage subsidy, or at least one way we try to operationalize wage subsidies is through tax credits. And so, for instance, one policy that is currently in effect are work opportunity tax credits, or WOTC, I've been told is how we say that, which covers up to 40% of the first $6,000 of wages paid in the first year of employment for people from target groups, which include people with recent felony convictions. Okay, so do wage subsidies work? Yes and no. So the best evidence I think we have that wage subsidies are effective comes from a really cool field experiment that a group of economists ran, Zoe Cullen, Will Dobby, and Mitch Hoffman. They ran a field experiment on a major online platform where lots of brick and mortar stores, think like Target and Wendy's and like big stores like that, hire temporary employees. So they go on, they have a bunch of eligibility criteria, and then it's basically first come, first serve. Whoever applies for the job, who meets the eligibility criteria, gets the job for that like 1 day temporary position. And so these researchers came in and they said, so let me start with the platform was interested in increasing employers' willingness to hire people with criminal records because they spend a lot of money on background checks. And they would love to spend less money on background checks. And so they had a reason to think, if we could get more employers to not care about the criminal record, we would have to do fewer background checks. That would save us a lot of money. So we'd be willing to pay something to shift that, right? That'd be worth it to the platform. So then the question became, okay, what could we change? What different incentives could we provide to the employers to get them to take the clean record off the list of eligibility criteria? So they tried lots of different incentives. It's a really cool field experiment. This is one of those papers that you read and you're like, oh man, I wish I'd written this. It's just such a cool, clever experiment. So they tried lots of different things. And at baseline, with no subsidy, no other information, no other incentives, 39% of employers said would be willing to hire people with criminal records. And so even just then, as soon as they asked this question, they're like, great, we're changing your official criteria for hiring. You're now, those people are now eligible for your jobs, so great. Then they looked at wage subsidies. So it turns out an 80% wage subsidy, so for every dollar you pay this person, the platform would pick up 80 cents of it. That's a big wage subsidy. Would increase that willingness from 39% to 51%. So that works, right? That shifted a lot of people, but that's a big wage subsidy to get that much of a shift. So I think, certainly I was disappointed by how small that shift was for, and I think 100% wage subsidy only went up to 54% or something. So if the person was free, you still had almost half of employers were like, no, thank you, which tells you there's something else going on here, right? So this suggests that low productivity might be a concern. So employers are somewhat worried, or at least some employers are worried that this person is simply not going to be productive enough to warrant the wage that they would have to pay them. And so if they had to pay a lower wage, then maybe they would be open to it. But it's not employers' main concern, or there are still at least a lot of employers where that's not the primary reason that they're not hiring people. Okay, so then let's talk about tax credits. The way we actually operationalize this in practice. So there are these online platforms that can do these wage subsidies. There are obviously nonprofit programs, and some cities have programs like this. But if we want to do this at scale, and the government does this, the main way we do it is tax credits. And so WOTC is the main tax credit we had for this. There's a recent paper that I'm I've seen it presented. I'm anxiously awaiting the actual working paper for this to circulate by Manisha Jean, Corinne Momert, and Jeff Weaver. And they use really detailed administrative data from Wisconsin to look at the effects of WOTC. And they find just across the board, these tax credits have zero impact on anything. They're not shifting employment, they're not shifting wages, there's nothing is going on here. The reason seems to be that basically employers collect this information and they promise applicants, we won't look at it, so you don't have to be worried about, about telling us the truth. They send it straight to their accountant so they get the tax credit. But if they don't see the information, there's no way it can change their hiring decision, right? That's the whole point of this, is to say oh, I know you have a felony conviction. That means we're gonna get this big tax credit for you, and so I'm more willing to hire you. Now, that thought process can't happen if they don't have the information. So anyway, so right now WOTC seems to be a giant waste of money. I think it's possible it could be reformed. I think that could be an interesting conversation. How could we do this better? Okay, the other category of risk here is, or the other cost is risk. So employers face some downside risk of bad behavior by their employees. This is all employees, not just employees with criminal records, right? So that bad behavior could include theft or violence on the job. Costs might include material losses from theft, reputational damage and loss of customers due to bad press, even legal liability. So if we want employers to hire people they view as higher risk, we need to reduce the costs that they would face if those employees did something bad. And a primary way we address risk is through insurance. So it turns out the federal government runs an insurance program called the Federal Bonding Program, which provides a free $5,000 of insurance coverage for employees with criminal records to cover losses due to theft, forgery, and embezzlement, so kind of property stuff. So does insurance work? Again, a hopeful yes, and this time a maybe, not a no. Okay, so back to that cool field experiment that these researchers ran on that online platform. One of the other things they tested was insurance. And so recall that at baseline, so no subsidy, no insurance, 39% of employers are willing to hire people with criminal records. $5,000 of crime and safety insurance increased that willingness from 39 to 51%. That was the exact same increase we saw from an 80% wage subsidy, right? So dollar for dollar, insurance had a much bigger bang for the buck. And that suggests, at least to me, that risk is a much bigger concern for employers. And they'll tell you this too. Like if you survey employers, they'll say we're worried about lawsuits or whatever. Based on this study, it turns out this hiring platform made it standard policy that there was $1 million coverage for any employer that was willing to hire people with criminal records. As I said before, this shifted enough employers to be willing to hire people with records that they saved a lot of money on background checks. So this insurance policy was worth it to them. So I think that's, I don't know. I think we're having a lot of internal conversations at AV right now about what are some creative policies like this that we could implement in government. Okay, federal bonding program. This is where we're actually trying to do this right now. Have been trying to do this since the 60s. The Department of Labor has been running this program since the 1960s. It's unclear if this program has any impact. There's no research yet measuring the impact of the program. The program's website states it covers about 1,000 people a year, which really is not very many people for a program that's been around since the 60s. No one seems to know about this program. I go around, no one's ever heard of it. So perhaps this is just a marketing problem, right? Maybe we just tell people about it and it could increase take-up and perhaps hiring, and we should try that. I'd love to see some research on that. But it might just be something about the fundamental nature of the program. Maybe the coverage is too low. Maybe $5,000 isn't enough. If employers are worried about violence or theft of high-value inventory, we might need a higher insurance amount. But so what if what if state and local governments piloted a more ambitious version of this, offered that $1 million level coverage for anyone who lives in that city, say, something like that? Okay, the other market failure we were talking about is information. So how could we increase information? My view from talking with employers is that most employers are desperate to find someone who will be usually qualified to fill an open role and would be a great employee on the job, especially for entry-level employers or for roles. The problem is a lot of people applying for these jobs would not be great employees, right? And so the challenge employers have is figuring out who among all the applicants would be that really great all-star employee that you can count on for things and who is not going to show up on day 3. And it's unfortunately just really difficult to tell from a job application, even an interview, who's going to be that rock star employee and who's not going to show up. And so that means the people who wouldn't make great employees have a really hard time signaling that to employers. So it's not a good, credible way. You could tell them you'd be a great employee, but yeah, sure, everybody tells them that, right? So how can we help provide more information, increase the amount of information that employers have about their job applicants so that they can better identify who would be a great match for this job, and facilitate more of these matches and hires that help people with criminal records get the jobs that they deserve. And so I have 2 ideas for you. One is court-issued rehabilitation certificates, which go by a bunch of different names, and one is letters of reference. So rehabilitation certificates are court-issued certificates that are available to people with criminal records who meet certain criteria, and these vary by state, which is kind of cool. There's some research to be done there. They provide 2 things: a strong signal that a judge who knows a lot about this person deems them rehabilitated and work-ready. The other thing it provides is protection from a possible negligent hiring lawsuit. So if this judge says that this person's rehabilitated, then how on earth could the employer have known that they weren't, that they were a problem? And so they essentially shift the risk from employers to judges, to go back to our how do we reduce risk conversation. So the question is, could these provide a positive credential that counter the negative credential that a criminal record provides? So there are a bunch of audit studies by Peter Leisure and colleagues that suggest that they do. They seem to increase callbacks from employers of people with records. And in those studies, applicants with a criminal record alone, as we've seen in lots of studies, are called back at much lower rates. People with a certificate are called back at equal rates as someone with no record at all. So these really do seem to help people get their foot in the door in the way that we're hoping policies like Ban the Box and Clean Slate would. So next, what we need here is a bunch of research on how all these state policies are actually working in practice, how much they've increased employment, have they had public safety benefits, what, with all this variation across states and how these are implemented, which are working best. Letters of reference. So there's been a randomized controlled trial led by Sarah Heller and Judd Kessler in the summer youth employment program space, so summer jobs for teenagers, looking at what would happen if they made it easier to provide recommendations for those kids based on the feedback from their supervisor over the summer. Would that help them get the next job? Because with these programs, basically, they find big reductions in crime, which is great, but not effects on employment, which is kind of weird, and people are trying to figure out how to improve that. So that simple intervention increased young people's subsequent employment by 4.5%, earnings by 4.9%. The mechanism here is, of course, providing credible information from someone who worked with this person that they'd be a good employee. So let's try something like this with the justice-involved population. This would be easy to do. There are a lot of programs out there, lots of nonprofits out there running cool programs. It'd be cool to see a research like this. So my overarching view on this is that if we want to change who employers hire, we need to directly address employers' concerns. Most policy efforts to date have focused on limiting information that employers have or limiting the information they can legally consider. So think about ban the box, clean slate. And those have been ineffective at increasing employment for the group we're trying to help. They also, and it's really important, risk shifting or increasing discrimination based on race. So these programs could actually be costly, not just ineffective. So instead, I would love to shift the field to focusing more on solving these market failures that are leading to our current, clearly suboptimal equilibrium here. This means changing the incentives that employers face, so wage subsidies, insurance, are increasing, not reducing, the information that employers have. So what I want to leave you with as we go into our discussions is what else could we try here, right? So history has shown these are difficult problems to solve. Many of our good ideas won't work. This is true across policy spaces. This is just an ever-present policy challenge. And so clearly our current state is not working, right? Like we can do better than this. We don't know how yet, so we need to be trying stuff, but we need to stay humble and make sure we're learning as we go, as we try. One additional public incentive I would love to see, I couldn't help myself, is I think that government should condition state and federal funds on doing rigorous impact evaluations of all the programs we're trying, right? We're not gonna figure out how to solve this problem if we just do lots of good stuff and then wonder 5 years from now what worked best. There are ways we can actually be learning from this as we go. But so I present a few ideas that are floating around, at least in the research world. I'm sure a lot of people in this room have many other ideas, so I would love to know, what else do you think might work to address the costs and risks employers face or to close information gaps? I will plug our big standing RFP here. I'm very proud of myself for this QR code. So we have a big standing RFP. We can fund anything related to any causal evaluation related to crime, the criminal justice system, or people with criminal records. So if you have an idea, or if some conversations have sparked an idea while you've been here, please send us a proposal. I'll leave it there. Thank you. Sure, no, I'll say that.